Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would talk about this video and kind of talk about this subject that I found to be very particularly interesting. And of course, for those of you that have been around my channel long enough, you know that I mainly like to talk about the sport of boxing and the sport of MMA because combat sports, they're pretty much my main forte. They're the main two sports that I've reviewed and that I've pretty much been commentating on for the longest, pretty much for the past 10 plus years. But of course, there is many other sports, or at least a few other sports that I also like to commentate on as well, and that I'm still knowledgeable on. I just don't tend to talk about them quite as much. One of these sports, of course, is that of the professional tennis circuit. And for those of you that have been paying attention or that have been tennis aficionados, if you want to call yourselves such a sort, or very experienced in terms of watching that of tennis, pretty much for the past 10 to 15 to 20 years, you know that there's been a very big race between three gentlemen, of course, called the Big Three. Roger Federer, of course, was the first one that pretty much started this race. He pretty much was a man by himself all the way back in the 2000s that pretty much stood out from everybody else. And then, of course, Rafael Nadal, he would come out a little bit later on at a very young age, winning his first Roland Garros title, I believe, in the early to mid 2000s. And then he would kind of be the main rival to that of Roger Federer. And Novak Djokovic, of course, he kind of came on a little bit later on. I believe that he turned pro all the way back in 2003, but he was looked at as a player earlier on in his career who was a very good player, was a very tough player, but never was a guy that was mainly threatening for that of Grand Slams. But of course, I believe in 2008, he ended up winning his first title at the Australian Open. And then a few years later, at 2011, Djokovic pretty much took the world by storm. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, he became the best player on the planet and probably was the most dominant player that I have personally ever seen in that of tennis history, especially in that of the men's tennis circuit. And ever since then, he's pretty much dominated the Grand Slam race pretty much for the past 10 plus years and has gotten to the point now to where Novak Djokovic, not only has he tied up the race, but he has surpassed both Rafael Nadal and that of Roger Federer in terms of the Grand Slam race. So the big question is now, after Novak Djokovic now has won that elusive 23rd title at that of the Roland Garros, and not only is leading the men's race in terms of the all-time Grand Slam race, at least in that of the Open era, and out of that of the Big Three, is he undisputably the GOAT? And of course, the second accomplishment with this is that he's the first and only man of the Open era to win every single title at least 3 times. Before, of course, he was the only man to win at least 2 times. And just my personal opinion, it still should be that way because I don't personally count the Australian Open that Rafael Nadal won last year. And I know a lot of people, they'll find that controversial. I know a lot of people will say, well, that was Novak Djokovic's choice to not take the vaccine and blah, blah, blah. Just my personal opinion. They were trying very hard to give Rafael Nadal that Australian Open title by banning Novak Djokovic from the Australian Open. Just my personal view of things. Because there was really no reason for a vaccine that really has shown no super duper effectiveness anyway in the first place. There was really no huge reason to ban clearly the best player of the Australian Open of the past, pretty much within tennis history to ban him. There really was no great reason, especially when you allowed him there pretty much for the past few years when the virus had been going on anyway. It really made no sense. It was very clear that once again they were trying to give a little bit of a push to that of Rafael Nadal, in my personal view. Which also begs the question, and I've said this before, what is the main problem that the media, and I pretty much know what the fan base is, why they have a problem with Novak Djokovic, because of course, they're fans. They're going to stick up for Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal. But it does make me wonder. The mainstream media also, they're not really that big of fans of Novak Djokovic. And in my view, it's not a good thing to be a fan in the first place because that ruins your logic and objectivity. But it does make me wonder, with all the criticisms, the unnecessary criticisms of Novak Djokovic and all the demeanings of Novak Djokovic from the media and basically trying to derank him as the debatable greatest of all time, it really makes me wonder, what is the main problem that the tennis media or that the higher-ups really have a problem with? Could it be because he's not as bought off as the Nike assets, Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal? Who knows? Now, Novak Djokovic still could be bought off just by that of different, accomplices. He could be bought off by that of different brands. Doesn't mean that he's not bought off just because he's not signed with Nike. But we know anyone who is signed with Nike, they're majorly pushed to the world, debatably as the greatest, or, basically with whatever they say. We also know that they're told to say certain things and that they're told to go with the liberal agenda, aka LeBron James, aka Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal, Serena Williams, other athletes of that sort, certain things like that. So once again, it does make me wonder, why is Novak Djokovic such an enemy to that of many tennis fans, but especially the tennis media? And we're going to talk about that in this video as well. But anyways, let's get straight into it. Let's see what they have to say. Because the question now is, of course, is Novak Djokovic the undisputed greatest of all time?
Let's bring you some more reaction to Djokovic's achievement, shall we? We'll speak to former British number 3, Barry Cowan. Barry, good evening. Always great to see you, and thanks for spending the time to chat to us. We heard that tweet from Rafa Nadal when he said that years ago 23 Grand Slam titles looked impossible, and yet Djokovic has made it possible. Just how has he done it?
Yeah, good evening, Julian.
Well, Djokovic, just to answer the question, Djokovic has done it by being the best all-around tennis player that the world has really ever seen, at least in terms of that of the open era. The thing is about Novak Djokovic is that, and this guy is going to say it here very soon, there really is no apparent weaknesses in that of Novak's game. He's a great returner, probably the greatest returner that I've ever personally seen, and many other people would attest to that. In my view, he's debatably one of the best servers I've ever seen, debatably the best server of his era. And when I say, server, I'm not talking about just in terms of power. Because, of course, when you talk about in terms of power, certain guys like Nick Kyrgios and other guys like that, they will probably have Novak Djokovic beat. But when you talk about in terms of mixing up his serve and making it a great adaptation to his game, and mixing it up and making it with a little bit of nuance to his game to make sure that it's not too one-dimensional, Novak Djokovic is up there with anybody. In terms of that, his backhand and his forehand are equally deadly. But you could debate that his backhand is even more deadly than that of his forehand. And his forehand is just as deadly almost as anybody out there. Now, I would debate that Rafael Nadal probably has the slightly better forehand, especially with a little bit more spin on the ball and, with a little bit more power. But Novak Djokovic, and I've already said this in the past, he's one of the few players, even on clay, but really no matter the surface, that can compete with that of Rafael Nadal's forehand by going toe-to-toe with him with the forehand. Now, you don't want to go with Rafael Nadal's forehand way too much. If you plan to beat him, you are going to have to go to his backhand, and you're going to have to try to run him across the court. Because if you go to his forehand way too much, it's not going to depend what the surface is, or it's not going to matter what the surface is, he is eventually going to get you. Because he's just way too fast, he's way too powerful, and he has way too much spin on the ball with that forehand. But Novak Djokovic, there's no doubt about it. There's a reason why he has been the most complete player on all courts throughout his generation, no doubt about it, because he, hands down in my view, is the best on hard courts, especially that of the faster hard courts, like that of the Australian Open. At least as of recently, they've been faster. He certainly is the best player on grass throughout his generation. That's why Roger Federer has only been able to beat him in the Wimbledon once, and that was when Novak Djokovic was not at his peak form. And clay, you would probably have to debate that he is the second best player of his generation. While as we talk about Roger Federer, he's probably the second best hardcourt player of his generation, the second best grass court player. And I understand that Roger Federer has one more Wimbledon title than that of Novak Djokovic. But to me, that really doesn't say a whole lot. When you were both at the peak of your powers, you were never able to beat Novak Djokovic when both of you were at the peak of your powers. And when we talk about clay court, Roger Federer definitely would be in third for that. When we talk about Rafael Nadal, he would be third for hard court. He would be third for grass. He would be first for clay. The thing is about Novak Djokovic is that he's not third in any one of those categories, and that's a big part of the reason of his argument as a debatable greatest of all time. Which really, if we're talking about a quote-unquote debate, when we really take a look at all the numbers, all the statistics, all the titles, it's really almost getting to the point where it's not really even a debate. I'm not going to say that it's not close because, of course, Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer, they've won a lot of great titles, but you have to have something over that particular player. But we're going to talk about that as the video goes along.
It is extraordinary because, it wasn't so far long ago. Actually, Sampras was breaking the record on 14. And then, of course, what we've been so lucky in this last couple of decades is we've had three phenomenal players. And I actually think without two, if we didn't have two of them and it was just one, they probably wouldn't have achieved what they have achieved, because they've just pushed each other to absolute greatness. And, Djokovic was the last of the three to emerge. I think that's where the loyalties were kind of very difficult, because what is...
I agree with that. And basically what he's saying is the same thing that I've been saying. And that's the reason why many tennis fans across the world, in my view, don't like Novak Djokovic. Because it was pretty much already set in their mind that this was the Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer era. And they were basically the main two favorites. And then all of a sudden Novak Djokovic came out of nowhere. And then all of a sudden people started saying, wow, this guy has a real chance of possibly surpassing these guys in titles. And I'm sure that rubbed them the wrong way. But it was very obvious that Novak Djokovic, that he was going to be a threat from the get-go. So it is what it is. But once again, the big question that I have is that what is the main problem that the tennis media has with that of Novak Djokovic? Very strange.
Become very tribal tennis. It was Federer or it was Nadal. And then up came Djokovic right in the middle. And just in my opinion, he's eclipsed both of them. I think the Grand Slams now back that up.
I don't even think it's the Grand Slams. When you talk about just everything. And let me also state this before I really get into the stats and all this other stuff. This narrative, because this is the main narrative that Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal and, tennis media fans, what they always have to use against Novak Djokovic. They always have to say, oh, well, yeah, he has longevity, but, he beat Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal when they started getting older and injuries and blah, blah, blah. All that is a bunch of horse shit. Rafael Nadal, by the time that Novak Djokovic reached his peak, and that 1 year, I believe, beat him 6-0, which I believe was in 2011, Rafael Nadal was like 25 years old. Like, people don't understand. Novak Djokovic and Rafael Nadal, they have 1 year difference between each other. You're not going to sit here and tell me that Rafael Nadal is washed up and he's been competing, competitively for Grand Slams ever since last year in 2022. You're not going to sit here and tell me that Rafael Nadal was just completely washed up. Now, in my view, Rafael Nadal, he was starting to show a little bit of slippage, especially ever since that of last year. But he still is great enough on the clay surface to where he was able to pull that last one out. Now, of course, you can tell that, I'm not going to completely count him out as of yet, but it's pretty clear that Nadal, he doesn't have much time left. And as for Roger Federer, at around that 2011 year, he would have been like 30 or 31 years old. Like, this bullshit narrative of Novak Djokovic beating them when they were quote-unquote old, all that is a bunch of horse shit. Like, Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal were clearly still in the primes of their careers. And all three of those players, Djokovic, Nadal, and Federer, they were all in the era to where you didn't just quit playing for Grand Slams at around 25 to 31 years old, like that of John McEnroe or Bjorn Borg or, Pete Sampras. None of those players. They weren't any of those players. They played in the longevity era, pretty much the same as Serena Williams, to where you could be competing for Grand Slams until around age 37. And it's also going to be very interesting to see how much longer Djokovic is going to be able to compete for Grand Slams, because as we know right now, he's 36 years old. He'll turn 37 next year. But as of right now, he still looks very, very competitive. That's also another reason why Djokovic, in my view, is usually a level above the rest, because when you talk about his conditioning, I've never seen another player as conditioned as what he is. I've seen Novak Djokovic not just mentally, but physically outlast opponents in certain matches. And that's exactly what he did to Carlos Alcaraz in the most recent match. Certain people were saying that it shouldn't count because of the injuries and blah, blah, blah. People don't realize that when you're in a stressful event and that type of weather that Carlos Alcaraz is probably not used to in terms of the French Open, it was 10 degrees higher in temperature or 10 degrees warmer in temperature than what it had been all tournament. And on top of that, Novak is a guy that he's not going to make it easy for you no matter what court surface you're on. He's going to run you across the court. He has an equally great backhand to his forehand, and he's a guy that has excellent defense and offense. So he's not going to make it easy for you. And in the first set, Novak Djokovic ended up beating him, I believe, 6-3. In the second set, of course, he ended up blowing it, I believe, 7-5. And then in the third set, Alcaraz started cramping. But that's because Novak Djokovic, his conditioning is on another level.
Longevity has 36 and his body looks 26, and that's, for me, is where I am absolutely astonished, because usually towards if you look back at, Sampras quit after he won the US Open, I think it was 2002, early 30s. McEnroe never won a major after 25. Ball quit at 25. And here's Djokovic at 36 years of age. And for as long as he wants to be the best, I believe right now he will be. And for me, I look at it too. Played 2-1-2 in terms of majors in 2023. We're going to be talking about the calendar slam again.
We'll speak more about.
I'll say this. I think that Novak Djokovic more than likely will win that of the Wimbledon. I'm not quite sure about the US Open though. For whatever reason, Novak Djokovic for the past several years, he's really not been too great in the US Open. He's always underwhelmed a bit, whether it's losing to that of Stan Wawrinka or, losing, by getting disqualified because of a stupid move that he made by hitting the ball and hitting a line judge, or getting swept by Daniel Medvedev. For whatever reason, Novak Djokovic has somewhat of a mental blockade in that of the US Open. I'm not necessarily sure why that is. Maybe it's because he's never really been as dominant on that court in some of the other ones. I'm not really sure what it is, but we'll see what he's able to do this year.
What more he can achieve and where he stands in the pantheon of great sports people over the years in just a moment, Barry. But you mentioned Nadal and Federer there as well. How does Djokovic differ from those two other greats?
Well, I think they are three totally different players. I mean, personally, if I was to watch tennis and be in awe of what type of shots they can hit, then Federer would be the one, because he is a shot.
Federer is up there in terms of the shots that he can make, and I don't really have a huge problem with that. But I think that I would still go with that of Novak Djokovic. For many people saying that Federer is the more skilled player of the two, I just don't see how that's really relatively possible. Once Novak Djokovic and Federer were at the peak of their powers at 2011, Novak Djokovic, I'm not going to say that he started dominating that rivalry, but he started clearly getting the edge in that rivalry, no doubt about it, especially in that of Grand Slams. There's a reason why Roger Federer, once 2011 hit, I'm not actually even sure if he ever beat Novak Djokovic in a Grand Slam tournament ever again after that year, but I could be wrong about that. One of you guys would have to correct me.
Maker's dream.
Actually, I think he beat him in the 2011 year in the Roland Garros. But then besides that, no other Grand Slam that he beat him in really comes to mind.
Nadal obviously brings incredible intensity. The forehand, obviously, clay is where he's excelled, 14 French Open titles. But in terms of the best tennis I've ever seen, has been from Novak Djokovic, and actually one of the best matches I've ever seen was a few years ago, the Wimbledon semi-final that was carried over for 2 days, which was Djokovic and Nadal. And those two, they pushed each other to...
Well, that Wimbledon, I believe, actually happened quite a while ago. I can't remember what exact year it was. That was a great Wimbledon final. That's also another argument, once again, for Novak Djokovic. Like when people argue for Rafael Nadal, and don't get me wrong, Rafael Nadal, in my view, if you wanted to debate him as the second greatest player of all time, I don't really have a problem with that. Now, certain people would debate that Roger Federer is debatably right there. I'm not really quite sure, and I understand people's points, because people would say that Rafael Nadal, that he still won a multitude of tournaments, but, he really is a specialist on clay, and he's limited on other surfaces. And that is, in my view, a knack against Nadal, that he is, at times, compared to Djokovic especially, and Federer at times, severely limited on other surfaces. But the reason why it doesn't really work as much against Federer is because Nadal has actually the advantage in the head-to-head in the Australian Open, I believe, when it comes to, beating, who. Now, of course, Roger Federer has, more titles than that of Rafael Nadal in the Australian Open, and also in that of the Wimbledon. I believe that, Roger Federer probably has the advantage there, but it's not like Rafael Nadal has never beat him there. I believe that he's beat him there once or twice. So like I said, it's not like Rafael Nadal never hold his own against that of Roger Federer. And Nadal's done, okay sometimes against Djokovic and other surfaces, but Djokovic, in my view, has been way more dominant against Rafael Nadal on his best surfaces versus Roger Federer was.
To new heights. And, in sport, and anyone that sort of is in love with that one-on-one battle, what you have is someone raises the bar, then someone can raise it even higher, and that's especially with the Djokovic Nadal rivalry. It's what we had with the Federer Djokovic rivalry, and of course what we had initially with the Federer and Nadal. But I was actually.
And the thing also is about Federer is that he has a losing head-to-head record, not just in Grand Slams, but in total to both Rafael Nadal and that of Novak Djokovic. Now, I actually seen a video the other day where he thought that potentially, now, of course, you have to take this with a grain of salt, because the YouTube channel was called Goatkovic, of course, alleging that he was pretty much a Novak Djokovic mega fan, so you have to take that with a grain of salt. But this guy was alleging that Rafael Nadal at times would pull out of tournaments and possibly maybe fake injuries to avoid that of Djokovic or Roger Federer in certain tournaments, to where he basically knew he was not going to win. Or maybe he knew that, he was not good enough to quite beat them. And I'm sure that maybe that's happened a couple of matches, especially since Rafael Nadal, he's never really quit on clay, but, I'm not really going to go quite that far. I would have to do a little bit more research, and, Rafael Nadal has always shown me that, he has great ability and that he has great heart. But, I would have to do more research on that. Now, do I believe at times that certain tennis players will pull out of a match because it will look better for their record to not take a loss to that main rival in a match that they probably know that they're pretty much going to get swept in? Yeah, I believe that happens sometimes. Like Rafael Nadal pulling out of the Wimbledon last year when he knew he probably was not in his best form. I think that pretty much was the best idea, because even if you get past Nick Kyrgios, there's no way you're going to beat Novak Djokovic on that surface. And if you do want an argument for the GOAT debate, why would you just give Novak Djokovic another win when you know damn well that, first of all, that's not your best surface, and second of all, you're probably not even at your best form. So we'll see.
Ask the question, what makes Djokovic so good? And almost without being negative, can I switch it the other way? There is just no weakness. You just cannot get.
I agree. There is no major weakness in that of Novak Djokovic's game, and that's why he's the most complete on whatever surface that he's usually on. Now, of course, Rafael Nadal has the advantage on clay, but every other surface, Novak Djokovic usually has the advantage on.
Through him. And as soon as he won that first set today, in my mind, it was over, because, history will tell you a lot, Julian, that when he wins the first set in a major, I think that's now 293 wins and only 5 losses. I mean, it's unbreakable once he gets in.
I agree. Novak Djokovic also is the mentally toughest tennis player that I've ever seen. Now, that's not me saying that he does not have mental lapses sometimes. At the US Open last year against Daniel Medvedev, in my view, it clearly was a little bit too much pressure for him for whatever reason. But when you talk about a lot of those very close matchups, especially that of Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal, Novak Djokovic seems to get better in a lot of those moments, especially on his preferred surfaces. And in my view, that's one of the knacks against that of Roger Federer, because there were certain games, there were certain slams that Roger Federer really should have won against that of Rafael Nadal or Novak Djokovic, like that 2019 one in the Wimbledon. I believe he was 1 point away from actually winning that title, or, getting a break point, and Novak Djokovic was down 40-15, and he ended up coming back. He may have even been down 40-0. I can't necessarily remember, but Roger Federer was not able to come back in that. There's been certain times where Roger Federer, he has cracked under the pressure, especially against both of those players.
How much it has to take to get through him over 4 or 5 hours physically and mentally. He kind of broke the back of Ruud, who played great in the first set.
So as you say, he's now eclipsed Nadal and Federer. You say that he plays the best tennis, in your opinion. If that's the case, why is there not as much love for him as there is for the other two?
Well, I think it's what I said.
Well, I think it's really for a multitude of reasons. First of all, as the man said earlier, Novak Djokovic, he came last. And whichever the player is that comes last, usually they're not going to be as adored. They're going to be looked at as quote-unquote interrupting the process. So I think that that's a part of it. I also think that it's possible that Novak Djokovic, that he is Eastern European, that could also be a part of it. But I think mainly it's because that, people did not want him to eventually surpass Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer. I think that they had already, set in their minds that those were going to be the two best. And once Novak Djokovic popped up in there, they realized that this guy was going to be a very big threat. And I'm sure that a lot of them, were thinking early on that, yeah, he's a big threat, but there's no way he's going to get 20 titles. People are overrating this guy. And then once they really seen him win those slam titles, I'm sure that, the bitter truth really hurt even more. But it is what it is.
At the start, tennis has become very tribal, which I think for me, obviously, it's been my sport for 40 years, and I'm really privileged to commentate on it. Been really privileged to interview all three. He's come right in the middle, and when your loyalties are to either Federer or Nadal, and then Djokovic comes in the middle, and he isn't aesthetically as good to watch as Federer. I don't think anyone ever will be. Certainly not in.
In my view, he is. That's one of the arguments against Djokovic, which is that he's allegedly boring. I've never personally found Djokovic boring, especially with his skill set level and with the way that he plays. But I agree with the first point, certainly, that, Novak Djokovic said he pretty much came last. He came in the middle of those two players, and people basically looked at him as a major interruption.
In my time. But his ability to be able to find peace when he feels a little bit the whole world's against him. At the start of the tournament, there were doubts about his fitness. He sort of was. He likes to feel, and he's found it that if the crowd are against him, he can challenge that to an absolute positive, and that's why mentally, he's unbreakable.
Well, certain people actually don't realize, but there are certain athletes, and I'm not really sure if Djokovic is one of these athletes or maybe he does good with it either way. But there's certain athletes that actually prefer to be booed or they prefer to be in a more hostile environment because then in their mind they pretty much have nothing to lose. All the pressure is basically off them. Gary Payton, I believe, said something very similar to that, I believe, when he faced Michael Jordan in the 1996 finals, to where he said, I actually prefer to be the bad guy. I actually prefer to be booed because then I basically have nothing to lose. All the pressure is off me. And, so once again, certain people who, they may not get it, who maybe aren't true competitors. And I'm not saying, of course, that I'm a professional, tennis player or athlete or anything like that. But for those of us that have competed in certain things, we can understand that feeling. Now, Novak also does well when he's sometimes cheered for, but it does seem like, that he relishes, in that, I'm not going to say bad guy role, but, being the guy that pretty much upsets the apple cart.
The US Open a few years ago when he was playing Federer. The noise in the Arthur Ashe Stadium at 24,000 people, and I think it was 23,990 were cheering on Federer. And that didn't affect him, as it didn't affect him those couple of Wimbledon finals when he played Federer when the crowd were massively pro him. He is a mental giant, but also his tennis has evolved so much. He's now become a very complete player. His serve is truly world class, and his net game has become even stronger over the years.
We posed the question at the top of the hour: is he the greatest tennis player of all time? Of course, he's level now with Serena Williams, one behind Margaret Court. He could level her total of 24 at Wimbledon. The other question we posed was: is he maybe the greatest sports person of all time? And I know it's a difficult question, Barry, but I know you love your.
Well, when we talk about just those two questions, I'll kind of do the first one first, and then I'll do the second one last. The first one, of course, talking about is he the greatest tennis player of all time? Well, Novak Djokovic, in my view, you have to certainly debate him as the greatest tennis player of all time. Now, certain people, of course, they'll bring Serena Williams or Margaret Court in the conversation. I do not put men and women in the same conversation. To me, they're separate genders, so they're put in separate categories. I do not compare both of those genders. Now, if you want to talk about the greatest female tennis players of all time, you probably have Serena Williams, Steffi Graf, and Margaret Court on one conversation. When you talk about the men's tennis circuit, you probably have Rafael Nadal, Novak Djokovic, and, Roger Federer possibly. But to me, to be honest with you, especially in the era that he pretty much set up, he pretty much has now been eclipsed by both of those players, in my personal view. Some people, of course, also would debate Rod Laver or Ken Rosewall or something of the sort. I'm not quite sure if I would put them in the conversation, but I understand, why people would. And of course, there's certain people that still would put Pete, Sampras, I believe, or, other people like that, like Bjorn Borg or whatever his name was, the player, I believe, from Sweden or wherever he was from, those certain players in there, which I get because they were not in the era to where you played until about 37 years old. I understand. But in my personal view, Novak Djokovic, just talking about all the records that he does have, especially in the amount of time, the most amount of days at number one, the most amount of weeks at number one, the most amount of end of the year number ones, I believe. On top of that, he has the most Grand Slams in terms of that of the Open era. In terms of men's history, he is the first male to win every Grand Slam at least 3 times. Like I said, in my view, still should be the first man to win it at least, every Grand Slam at least twice. Because I think there's a little bit of an asterisk on that second Australian Open title of Rafael Nadal, but maybe that's just me. And I don't mind if you count it, but I just personally do not. And he has a multitude of other statistics as well. He's tied for the most amount of ATP finals with 6. It's possible that he might get more. He's the most complete tennis player almost on every surface of his era. Novak Djokovic just pretty much has everything in the bag.
The sports as well. I mean, would you make an argument that he is the great?
And what's very strange is that Novak Djokovic with all those areas, for whatever reason, for his particular sport, he is pretty much, you take a look at a list recently before Novak Djokovic won this 23rd Grand Slam. He has all these statistical advantages and is tied with anyone in the history of his sport for the men's circuit, especially of the Open era. And you look up lists, and people will put Novak Djokovic at either the 5th or like the 3rd spot, which once again goes to show, why do they have such a problem with Novak Djokovic? Because there is no calculative, there is no logical argument to put him that low, especially if you have Rafael Nadal or Roger Federer that high. It just makes no sense because Novak Djokovic did beat Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal still when they were in their peak years. Don't let this tennis media fool you. They did. And on top of that, he has every statistical advantage, which goes to show once again, which makes me wonder, is it possible because Novak Djokovic is not as bought off as some of the other liberal shills and that of the Nike media? Who knows?
Yes, I would. Yes, I would. You're always...
Because Novak Djokovic literally has to lead in every category just for him to debatably be the greatest of all time by that of the tennis media. Because if he literally doesn't lead in every single category, they're going to rank him anywhere from 3 to 5, which in my view is absolutely ridiculous.
You're always going to be biased in your own sport. I get that. And there would be, whether it be boxing or whether it be football or whether it be, some of the other great sports that there are. But when I look at the era that we've had in terms of the Federer, Nadal, the Djokovic, the fact that what Djokovic has been able to do, and what happened last year, I'm not going to go into detail, but what happened last year, and I felt it at the time, would actually lengthen his career because it gave him sort of time to step away and almost just mentally just regroup. Not that he necessarily needed to regroup because he was the best player in the world even at the start of 2022. But right now, which was the same with Nadal a few years ago, and it was also the same with Federer before, unfortunately, his knee enabled him to pack up. The first thing that will go with those guys is the will, because they are extraordinary. And right now, Djokovic still, it seems, has got a lot that he wants to achieve. And while he's got that, the desire, obviously Alcaraz is going to be very exciting. He's only going to improve and get better. And his experience that he got on Friday against Djokovic, look at that. He broke the back of Alcaraz, who, physically is.
I agree. And Alcaraz undoubtedly is a very worthy challenger for Novak Djokovic. And he's going to be for these next few years. There's no doubt about it. He's especially going to have to worry about him in the French Open and in the U.S. Open every single year. Now, in the Wimbledon and in the Australian Open, if Djokovic is at the peak of his powers or pretty damn close to it still, he can probably, I'm not going to say relatively easily, but, with relative dominance, probably beat him there. Because Alcaraz, a little bit like Nadal, he seems to have problems, especially in those 2 tournaments. But we'll see what happens.
Scene was unstoppable, and he only lasted a couple of sets. For me, Djokovic would be the best tennis player I've ever seen. The records will show that, obviously, in the men's game, and certainly one of the greatest sports person that I.
And when we talk about Djokovic as the debatable greatest athlete of all time, I'm not really sure if there's a definitive debate about who is the greatest athlete of all time. But when you talk about Novak Djokovic, he's up there with anybody. He's going to be up there with Tom Brady. He's going to be up there with Michael Jordan. He's going to be up there with Floyd Mayweather Jr., or whoever you count for boxing, John Jones. He's going to be up there with Jerry Rice. He's going to be up there with, whoever else you want to count. Lionel Messi, Pele, or, Pele, however you pronounce his name. I've heard it pronounced so many different ways. He's up there with anybody, no doubt about it. Now, is he going to get the same acclaim as those guys? Because is he going to be as popular? No, probably not. But in terms of recognition, in terms of what he's accomplished, yeah, in my view, he's up there with any of those guys.
That I can ever remember, yeah.
Final
Usain Bolt, Michael Phelps, those same guys as well.
question, Barry, about another of the old guard, Andy Murray, who a couple of hours ago after the rain delay won the Surbiton Trophy, his first title on grass since Wimbledon 2016. He'll head into Wimbledon as a seed now. Just how significant will that victory be for him, do you think?
Well, I mean, he obviously has felt it was important that he is to be seeded. He thinks that's a benefit. I'm not so sure, actually, because by just scraping into the seeds means you could play a Djokovic third round, where if you weren't seeded, then you might sort of get a potentially favourable third round. He will counteract and say, well, I want to play Djokovic first round. But I think where I think Andy is at the moment is that he's shown this year he can play some really good tennis. He obviously made that statement over a week ago. He said, I feel in my mind one of the best grass court players, and obviously that he has the experience. I mean, where of course he needs a favourable draw, and he needs everything. A lot of things go his way in terms of the draw. But there aren't that many great grass court players. So some of the top 10 players, if they lose early, and there's always a section of the draw at Wimbledon that opens up, and maybe there might be two sections of the draw open up. If Murray is in one of those sections, then he has the experience. But the fact that he's still got the motivation, that's what I find extraordinary. He's played the Challenger this week. He's going to play another Challenger next week in Nottingham. We talk about still having the desire. He has it in abundance. Unfortunately,
But anyways, that's pretty much about it. Was hoping overall they'd talk a little bit more about Djokovic, but of course they're talking about Andy Murray. Of course, the British great, for those of you that do not remember him. Actually, the only player that, at the peak of his powers, I believe, he's the only man to defeat Novak Djokovic in that of a Wimbledon final. I believe that happened either in 2013 or 2014. I thought it was 2014, but I can't necessarily remember. Someone correct me if I'm wrong on that. But anyways, that's pretty much about it. I thought that I would talk about that. As for Carlos Alcaraz, of course, I believe that he is going to pretty much carry that of the jockstrap of Novak Djokovic and those other two players, Nadal and Roger Federer, for the next probably 15 to 20 years, however long he lasts. He appears to definitely be the most progressing player in terms of his skill set. And on top of that, he just seems to be the most skilled. And to be quite honest with you, if I'm Tsitsipas or, some of these other guys or, not necessarily Daniel Medvedev, because Medvedev has actually shown a lot of great strides, but if I'm Alexander Zverev or if I'm Stefanos Tsitsipas or one of these other guys, I'm embarrassed by the fact that this dude at 20 years old has pretty much already accomplished more than what any of those guys have done, just in terms of Grand Slams and that of the number one ranking. But, it is what it is, because Stefanos Tsitsipas, I watched that match and I was, really hoping that it was going to be a nice competitive match. It was not really competitive until the final set. Stefanos Tsitsipas, he really had a lot of holes in his game that got exposed in that, semifinal matchup. Or not semifinal, but quarterfinal matchup. He really was very subpar compared to Carlos Alcaraz. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see where this story goes from here. I believe that Novak Djokovic more than likely probably will win more Grand Slams, but let's see what happens. Anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.